Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar this morning. I will just check the participant list. Yes, oh, we have already many participants. The other one will jump in. So today we will discuss VAT for International Association. Maybe first word to present yourself. So I am Lionel Willemens, working at PwC in the indirect tax department. And for many years, I've been working with International Association based in Brussels. So that's why we will see different issues and topics that I've seen with those associations. Jean-Baptiste?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining. My name is Jean-Baptiste Sanchez, and I have been working at PwC for almost 4 years. And during this time, I have also gained some knowledge and experience in helping non-for-profit organizations and international associations with reviewing their VAT position and implementing VAT recovery methods that are optimal. So yeah, we received a lot of interesting questions from you when you registered. So we hope that today we'll be able to shed some light to some of the VAT issues your organization is facing, and we'll make sure to revert back to you after this webinar to see whether everything was sufficiently clear and whether you would like to further discuss some topics with us.
Thank you, Jean-Baptiste. In terms of practicalities, we have the chat, so if you wish to raise question, do not hesitate to post question in the chat. We will try, when possible, to reply directly during the presentation to those questions. Well, if it is not possible, we will reply by email afterwards or contact you. Regarding the agenda, the idea is to really look at the VAT status of an association as if we were in a meeting with an association in order to assess the VAT status, the VAT deduction, the specific topics like organization of events, the common issues like invoicing membership fees to association based in other countries, like recharging of costs between association and so on. So we will really try to be as practical as possible, as I think that a lot of attendees are not tax specialists and certainly not VAT specialists. So we will try really to be as clear as possible. Quick introduction. If we look at how the VAT system works, well, most of the time we are working with companies. Companies receive invoices with VAT. They supply goods and services to their client. Could be corporate, B2B, or client, consumer, B2C. And most companies can fully recover input VAT, so they can recover the VAT they've paid on the invoice of their supplier. And VAT is in principle neutral, meaning that VAT is not a cost for those companies. There are a lot of exceptions, of course, in the financial sector, for instance, the real estate sector, but in general, company can fully recover input VAT. And now if we look at what is happening with not-for-profit association, well, you will also receive invoices with VAT from your suppliers. And then in most of the case, the main revenue will be a membership fee, but you will also provide, supply other services to, could be member, other association, and also non-members. And additionally, you can receive grants to finance some activities or specific projects. And then several questions should be raised. What is the VAT treatment of those membership fees of the supply of services? And what is the percentage of VAT recovery that you can apply? And so what I often say is that the VAT status of a not-for-profit association can be more complex than the VAT status of a standard company, because you have to play with VAT exemption, with very specific rules. And of course, in most of the association, there is no tax team that can be fully working on the different tax aspect of the invoicing and VAT compliance and things like that, like it happens in standard companies. Another remark, non-for-profit does not mean no application of VAT. So actually, the not-for-profit organization should follow exactly the same rules as other companies. So there is no global VAT exemption when you are a not-for-profit association, but we will see that in more detail. When we look at the VAT status of an association, we always start to look at the revenue side. So we look at the different type of revenue, if those revenue are subject to VAT, exempt, or could be also totally outside the scope of VAT. Based on that analysis, we can determine the VAT status of the association, and then we can assess the VAT deduction. It could be 100% VAT deduction. It could be pro rata, so something below 100%. It could be something that we call real use VAT deduction method. We will see that later in the presentation. And if your association is fully exempt from VAT, the percentage of VAT deduction is likely to be 0. And now let's have a quick look at the main type of revenue that we can have in an association. So here we made a distinction between the revenue exempt from VAT or not subject to VAT and the revenue subject to VAT. First type of revenue are the membership fees. Could be VAT exempted, but you see that we also mention membership fee in the revenue subject to VAT, and we will see that in detail just after. Then we could have the grant subvention that are not subject to VAT. We could have revenue of loans, so like interest, that are not subject to VAT. We can receive gifts, donation, that are not subject to VAT. So we see that we have different type of revenue that are not subject to VAT. There are other examples. For example, the organization of trainings could also be exempt from VAT. If we look at the revenue subject to VAT, well, could be the membership fee, could be sponsoring, organization of congress, royalties, license are always subject to VAT, service fee are normally also always subject to VAT, and recharge of costs are normally also always subject to VAT. We will see that in more detail with some example afterwards. But I will start with the membership fee, and just to give you a little bit of background, and here we should refer to the VAT directive that has been implemented in the Belgian VAT code in the article 44, paragraph 211, which exempts the supply of services that are remunerated by a membership fee paid to a not-for-profit association when the objective of the association is political, trade union, religious, patriotic, philanthropic, and so on. In the case at hand, what will be more interesting for us is the objective of trade union nature, because that is what will mostly concern a sector association, as we have many in Brussels, because this association will defend the interest of a specific sector, could be the chemical industry, the automotive industry, and so on. So if I look at the condition to apply the exemption on membership fee, first, the association receiving the membership fees should be not for profit. This exception is easy to meet and to understand because in Belgium we have the ASBL, VZW, so legal entity with a not-for-profit aim. Could also be a foundation, for instance. And of course, that condition will not be met if a membership fee is invoiced by a limited company, for instance. Then we have the second point, which is the membership fee should be somewhere mentioned in the bylaws, in the statutes of the association. And that's why we should make the distinction between a service fee that is invoiced to the member and a membership fee. The distinction is not always that easy. We have simple solution or situation where we have a fixed membership fee for all members. But in many cases, we have variable membership fee that could depend, for instance, on the turnover or production of the members. That remain membership fee because it can be fixed in the bylaws. But when, for instance, you invoice something specific to a member because he has a specific request, technically that will not fall in the scope of membership fee, and so will not meet the condition for the VAT exemption. Sometimes it is not that easy to make the difference, but it's important to clearly try to assess what is clearly membership fee and what is not. A difficulty could come when you have different kinds of member. For example, full member or member with limited right and things like that. So the best is, of course, to define that properly in the bylaws and to define clearly the membership fee that are attached to those members. Then we have this notion of trade union objective, and that is where it becomes a little bit tricky, and we will see that. So next point, what's important is to understand is that the membership fee is fully exempt if all the conditions are met, and if the conditions are not met, the membership fee is normally fully subject to VAT. I say that because before 2012, when the Belgian VAT Administration published a circular letter on the VAT exemption related to a trade union, the situation was not clear, and we had the same association doing exactly the same activities. One was fully exempting the membership fee, the other one was not applying the exemption, and we could have a third one applying, for instance, 80% VAT on the membership fee. So that was really a situation of the past. normally today you should try to define if the membership fee is VAT exempt or not, and then it will apply to the full membership fee without having, for instance, 80% subject to VAT, 20% exempt. I know that there are still agreements existing with the VAT authorities where they do not apply that rule strictly. So if you do not apply that rule strictly, it's important to have a formal agreement with the VAT authorities. So I mentioned that the situation changed in 2012, indeed, because the VAT authorities published a circular letter with several elements to help to define what is trade union objective. For me, it is sometimes a quite subjective judgment to make. And when I meet a sector association, most of the time they say, well, everything that we do is actually lobbying, because we are there to defend our members. And that is certainly true. But if we look at the definition given by the VAT authorities and the example given by the VAT authorities, the situation is not that clear. So clearly, when you have activities in view of influencing policy decision-making process, what we can define as pure lobbying or advocacy work, that is clearly work that is considered as trade union. And then everything that is related to the defense and the representation of the interest of the member towards third parties is also an activity of trade union. And to do that, it may require the publication of studies, position papers, things like that, that will then also be considered as having an objective of trade union nature. Then we have other examples that are not considered as having an objective of trade union nature, like providing advices, information, statistics to the members, organizing networking among the members, also other activities like the promotion of some commercial activities, research, development, legal consultation, administrative advice. All that is not regarding as trade union. Representation at trade show, fairs, and things like that. Organizing events, kind of promotion, advertising campaigns, and so on, is also not regarded as trade union. So if we look at that, it is quite difficult to make an assessment with some association. And what we try to do is put some metrics on that. And also look at what information is available and on what can we base your judgment. For instance, one of the key points is to look at the website. If we see that the association is the voice of, then that's an element that will tend to say, okay, the main objective of that association is trade union, so defending the interest of the members. We look at the bylaws, statutes, because in the bylaws you need to define the objective of the association. Of course, you may have several objectives, like defending the interest and providing technical studies to the members, making market survey, and things like that. So it is not always clear-cut, of course. You need to look at the publication of the association. Well, what do we work on? What do we publish? Studies, statistics, or mostly position papers? That will help to make a judgment. Minutes of the board, of course, are important. Staff composition, job description of the team is important. Well, if we have a lot of people like senior advocacy people and things like that, that will tend to say, okay, the objective is defending the interest objective of trade union nature. If we have mostly technical people doing surveys and things like that, well, the situation is different, of course. We also look at revenues, membership fees versus other services, activities like organization of events, conferences, and things like that. And it is also interesting to look at the transparency register, where in a certain way you define what you are doing in relation with the EU institution. So that's typically the basic information we look at. And then, as I said, we also try to put some metrics on that and looking at the revenue. Well, here in the pies, for instance, we see that I have an association providing a lot of services to its members. So that could be an element to say that the main objective of the association is not the defense and interest of the members. That, of course, should be analyzed with all the other elements. On the second pie, I see that at there we look at what is the team doing. And so we try to make an assessment of on the time spent, and if we see that advocacy is a very big element, it tends to say that, well, the main objective is trade union, and so the membership fee would be VAT exempted. But you see, it is not a black or white assessment. There is a certain level of subjectivity, and it is certainly not easy. Of course, a lot of associations do not try to work in a VAT subject status, and so they just say, well, actually, our main objective is clearly defense of the interest of the members. Our membership fee will be VAT exempted, with the consequence of a limitation of the deduction on the VAT on the cost, of course. So, for example, here the situation is not totally clear-cut, because of course advocacy is an important element, but I have other activities. And what should I do in that case? Well, actually, it's important, of course, to secure the situation, because the association is responsible towards the board, towards the member, and, well, of course, it is important to avoid a discussion, a litigation with the Belgian VAT authorities. That could be costly. So I would say that in most of the cases, if clearly there is an important aspect of trade union nature defense of interest of the members, the VAT exemption will be easily accepted by the Belgian VAT authorities, because that is what they expect actually from an association. On the other hand, if you want to play with membership fees that are subject to VAT, it is certainly important to have a good case, a good defense file, and to maybe also to have an agreement with the Belgian VAT authorities, so that your situation is fully secured. Because of course, if you do that, you have an advantage that you can recover more input VAT on your cost, but we will see that later on. So you see that membership fees is something complex, and the first step is to analyze the VAT status and the VAT treatment of your membership fee in Belgium. Once you know that, the second step is to invoice those membership fee to your members, and Jean-Baptiste will explain what could be the pitfalls there.
Thank you, Leo. Yes, indeed. We should make a distinction whether or not the membership fee is exempt of VAT or subject to VAT. And we've seen, Leo has explained, it's not black and white. It's not always a clear cut. So the assessment is not always easy. But let's assume for a second that your assessment came to the conclusion that the membership fees of your organization are exempt of VAT. Well, then, indeed, it's very important to look at the VAT status of the members to whom you are issuing your invoices. If you can benefit from a VAT exemption and your members are established in Belgium, so no issue there, no Belgian VAT on your invoice. If your members are, for instance, corporate members, local associations in other EU member states, and they have a valid VAT number, then same, no Belgian VAT on your invoice, and in general, the VAT exemption will also apply locally for those members, the recipients. If you have EU members without a VAT number, can be local associations which are fully VAT exempt in their country, for instance. Well, there again, no Belgian VAT, and general VAT exemption will also apply locally. So there again, not much of an issue. Same for if you have non-EU members, no VAT is due. But really a big attention point is the fact that the VAT treatment of membership fees for NPOs is something that is not sufficiently harmonized within the European Union. There may be differences in interpretation from one local VAT administration to another. So that is something to bear in mind. If, however, we saw that, okay, the trade union objective is not so much fulfilled, and the assessment concludes that actually it is subject to VAT, you do a lot of statistical work and not so much representing the interest of your members, you do advocacy, for instance, quite a lot, then, okay, let's assume your membership fees are fully subject to VAT. Then again, let's have a look at your members. It's not going to be an issue if you have Belgium established members, you're going to issue invoices with the standard VAT rate of Belgian VAT. If, again, you have members in other EU member states with a valid VAT number, there again, no Belgian VAT on your invoice. However, the EU member, corporate member, local association with a VAT number will, in his country, have to pay local VAT via the reverse charge mechanism. And you, as a non-for-profit organization, should, within your Belgian VAT obligation, you should report this in your VAT return and also in your EC sales listing, your European Community sales listing. If you have EU members, again, without a VAT number, in principle, you should issue invoices with Belgian VAT. That is the rule. But there is a tolerance in place in Belgium, which says that if you can provide proof that the membership fee is actually exempt of VAT at the place of supply, where your EU member without VAT number is established, then you can issue an invoice without VAT. And if you have non-EU members, well, there again, there's no VAT that is due. And well, that's very exceptional, but in very specific cases, if your non-EU member is a B2C member and a private individual, Belgian VAT may be due, but that's very exceptional. So there again, it's very important to check the status of your members. It's important for the VAT treatment, it's important for your invoicing requirements and for your VAT reporting.
Maybe just to add a word on that. So as Jean-Baptiste explained, if we look at the table when the membership fees is exempt or subject to VAT, in most cases, it is quite straightforward. Where do we see the problem? It is mostly with local associations that are members of a Belgian association, and there start the discussion because their VAT status is not similar to the Belgian one. The approach is totally different, and it's difficult to explain what we are doing when we issue an invoice for the membership fee with Belgian VAT because they do not understand it, and because it's a cost for them. And so it's in order to solve that problem, it is important to try to clarify that as soon as possible when a member becomes a member. Also important to mention that the membership fee, if subject to VAT, should be considered as, for instance, exclusive of VAT. So you do not have that discussion about, well, I paid that amount, I will not pay more if VAT is due or not. Well, that's also a commercial discussion, but it's important to try to clarify that because otherwise the problem will come one day or another, and that is mostly in the relationship with local association that cannot recover input VAT, and so they are surprised if they see an invoice with Belgian VAT. I see a question, how can we check the validity of a VAT number of a member organization outside of Belgium? Well, there is a website from the EU Commission where you can do that. We will put the link in the presentation that we will send, so we will add something on that.
Yeah, indeed, we'll do so. So we've seen now the VAT treatment of membership fees. There are also other sources of revenues that a non-for-profit organization may have. Sponsoring is one of them. It is subject to VAT if it is considered as the remuneration for advertising. That's sometimes also a bit difficult to assess and not always clear-cut to see the distinction whether or not the sponsoring is it true sponsoring, or is it actually the remuneration for a service, for an advertising service. That's important to keep in mind. Donations are typically not subject to VAT. Same for grants and subventions, but careful with grants, and Leo will discuss it later on. Grants may also, in some specific circumstances, depending on the case, depending on how the contract is drafted, may be considered as a remuneration for the supply of a service. And in that case, the grant is actually subject to VAT. We'll see that further on. Like I said, maybe there might be some milestones in the contract and certain conditions, and it is drafted in a way that's actually, it's not a grant, it's the remuneration for a service. We'll see also more in detail later on the VAT treatment of the organization of a congress, an event, and how to treat from a VAT perspective the entrance fee. It is in principle subject to VAT from a Belgian VAT perspective. But in some exemptions may apply if we can argue that there's an educational purpose behind it, it's a training, and there may be a VAT exemption, we may benefit from a VAT exemption. And the VAT rules should definitely be examined locally where the event is taking place, because again, the VAT treatment may vary from one EU member state to another. An internal training typically is VAT exempt, provided that a number of specific conditions are met. Like I mentioned, arguing that there's an educational purpose behind it, you are not for profit. So this typically we'll see it as VAT exempt. A service fee, royalties for a license, typically subject to VAT, and the interest on loans, typically VAT exempt. And we will also see a bit more into detail with Lionel the recharge of costs, which typically is subject to VAT if recharged to another non-for-profit organization which is not part of the same legal entity, and including the recharge of salary cost. We'll see that later on. So now what we've seen so far is the VAT treatment of revenues, and that will give us an indication of what is the VAT status of my association. And we've taken 3 simple examples, but which will actually cover all the possible scenarios out there. 3 examples. The first one, I'm a non-for-profit organization and I issue invoices to my members for the membership fee. And after a deep assessment, metrics, etc., I say it's subject to VAT. Okay, then I am fully taxable, VAT taxable person. In another second scenario, I have 2 types of revenues. I have membership fees, which from a Belgian VAT perspective, say they are VAT exempt. But I also have revenues for services I render to my members, to other associations, to non-members that are subject to that. And there, I am a mixed VAT taxable person, performing both exempt and taxable VAT services. And in the third and last example, there I take back my membership fees, and if I say that they are VAT exempt, fully VAT exempt, well then I am fully exempted association. Now, okay, I know the VAT treatment of my revenues, I know the status of my association, and I have costs coming in. Some costs may be with VAT, some costs may be exempt from VAT or not subject to VAT. Typically, salaries will not be subject to VAT. Rent will be exempt from VAT. There may be some exceptions. We'll see them later on. Interest paid, exempt of VAT. Grants paid, not subject to VAT. And we'll also look into detail the director fees, because typically a director fee, well, if the director is on the payroll of the non-for-profit organization, well, then it's not a director fee, it's a salary. So there's no VAT there. But if a director is acting as a private individual, there it's also exempt from VAT, but we'll see that's a tolerance. I'll go further into detail of the director fees later on, because director fees can also be subject to VAT if issued from its own company. And then costs subject to VAT. Well, the basis rule is that all acquisitions of goods and services are subject to VAT, but there's maybe some exceptions, some exemptions may apply, some costs may be outside the scope of VAT. An attention point here, so I mentioned the directive fees, so it will not be subject to VAT if the invoice is issued by a director in his capacity as natural person, but it will be subject to VAT if the director is a legal person. He issues his invoice from his management company. And rent, we will see some exceptions. Some rental contracts can be subject to VAT. We'll look into this further into detail. Here, some costs coming in. You may have your Belgium established non-for-profit organization, you have a Belgium supplier providing services to you. Typically, you will have VAT on these invoices, and depending on your VAT status, depending on your VAT deduction right, it may be then a cost. Services from non-Belgium suppliers will also be subject to VAT. So, and that's I will discuss later. You may have you may be a non-for-profit organization in Belgium. You receive an invoice, let's say, from the UK for some advocacy work. You are not registered for VAT. You receive an invoice. There is no VAT on that invoice, but actually, Belgian VAT is due, and you should pay that VAT via the reverse charge mechanism. And if you're not already registered for VAT, you should register to make the payment to the Treasury. We'll see later on, there's a special VAT number that can be requested for these kind of situations. And then I already mentioned interest paid and grants that are paid are typically not subject to VAT. But again, same attention point on the grants. It needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis and how the contract is drafted, because it may actually be the remuneration for the supply of a service. That's VAT deduction. So how much can my association recover? Let's take back those examples from the VAT status. My only revenue is membership fees subject to VAT. I am fully taxable, but then I have 100% VAT deduction on my incoming costs, on the Belgian VAT that is on my incoming cost. I am a mixed VAT taxable person because I have two types of revenues. I perform services that are VAT exempt, subject to VAT. I am mixed. Well, there, how can I recover VAT? Well, the basic rule will be a general pro rata. So we'll have to look at a fraction. How much is subject to VAT divided by my total amount of revenue. But I'll give an example later on to make it more clear. And another method, VAT recovery method, is the reuse method. And it's a little bit more analytical. It's a bit more complex, takes a little bit more time, but we'll see that in some cases, it may increase your VAT recovery rate. And in the example where the only type of revenue I have is membership fees that are, from a Belgian VAT perspective, exempt from VAT, well, I have no deduction. I am an exempt taxable person. I cannot deduct any VAT on my incoming cost. Let's take that second example where I am a mixed VAT taxable person. And let's make it a bit more concrete. Let's say I receive 150,000 euros on membership fees. And I say they are VAT exempt. And on the other side, I have a service, I provide services, I receive a remuneration for it, and those are services which are subject to VAT for 100,000. As a mixed VAT payer, I have to look into my input VAT deduction right. It will not be 100%. It would be typically below 100%, and I have two methods. I mentioned the pro rata. Okay, let's assume I have 100,000 euros of input VAT, so that's not my costs, that's the VAT on my costs. Well, if I do a general pro rata, I'm going to look at the turnover with VAT, that's my 100,000 for my service fee. And then I'm going to divide it with my total turnover, so my revenue from my service fee and plus my membership fees, so 250,000, which gives me a VAT deduction right of 40%, which makes then 140,000 euros of VAT deduction, because I mentioned I have on my cost 100,000 Belgian VAT. Well, I will be able to deduct 40,000. Same example, but I don't use the general pro rata rule. I use the reuse method. And I have a more deep dive look into those 100K of Belgian VAT. Actually, I see, if I do a little bit of analytics, that I have 21,000 euros input VAT related to the costs that can be attributed to my service fee. I have 19,000 euros of Belgian VAT that can be allocated to the costs related to my membership fees. And I have 60,000 euros of Belgian VAT that is related to general costs. It's general costs. I can't really exclusively attribute it to my membership fees or my service fee. So here, I'm gonna look into it step by step. Where can I have a full VAT deduction? Well, the cost related to my service fee. I have my service fee subject to VAT, then I am allowed to recover 100% of the input VAT that is directly related to those costs, 21,000. What about my input VAT related to the costs on membership fees? Well, those 19,000 euros, I'm not going to be able to recover. And finally, my general costs, those 60,000 euros of input Belgian VAT, well, there I will use a special pro rata. And actually, that special pro rata, I can use different methods depending on my sector, in real estate and financial services. But here, let's make it simple. The special pro rata will be calculated the same way I have calculated my general pro rata. So again, I will look into what is my turnover subject to VAT divided by my total turnover. That's why I have again my 40%. So 40% on my 60,000 euros of Belgian input VAT, 24,000 euros. So I have a total recovery of 45,000 euros. So with this example, with this simplified example, here you can see that I can, depending on the amounts of my revenues, depending on the costs I have, I may have an advantage in using the reuse method. This reuse method, typically, there is no obligation to obtain the approval from the Belgian tax authorities on this one, but there is an obligation to inform them. So typically, if you don't use the general rule, which is the general pro rata, and you prefer using the reuse method because it gives you a financial advantage, it increases your VAT recovery rate, well, there you should at least prepare a letter towards the VAT authorities to inform them on this decision and to explain the types of revenues you have, the type of cost you have, and how you calculate your VAT deduction rate. Your VAT obligation. I go back to my first two examples, the one where I am a fully taxable person with 100% VAT deduction right, and the one where I am a mixed VAT taxable person where I use a reuse method or the general pro rata. What are going to be my obligations? Well, typically, as from the moment that I perform services that are subject to VAT, I should register for VAT purposes in Belgium. I will have to be compliant from an invoicing perspective. I will have to be compliant also on my bookkeeping, on the archiving of my invoices, of my books and documents. I will have to file VAT returns on a periodic basis. Depending on my turnover, it will be on a monthly basis or on a quarterly basis. I also have the obligation to file European Community sales listings. If I have, let's take again the example that I have membership fees that are subject to VAT. My member is in another EU member state. I issue an invoice without VAT, but that invoice needs to be reported in my Belgian VAT return, and it should also be reported in my EC sales listing. The obligation to also file a yearly client listing for all the suppliers of services that I've made to Belgium established members, non-members, and other associations with a Belgian VAT number. And I should also, well, issue invoices with VAT. If I issue invoices with VAT, I need to collect that Belgian VAT. I need to pay that Belgian VAT to the Belgian Treasury. And like we mentioned before, it gives me a right to request a refund on the input VAT that I have incurred on my costs, depending on the method I use. This, of course, needs to be checked on a case-by-case basis. If I take my third example, where my membership fees were considered as completely fully VAT exempt, I am a fully exempt taxable person. I have no VAT obligations, none of what I've mentioned before. But I may be in that scenario, and I may have received invoices, like I mentioned before. I may receive invoices from suppliers in the UK, non-EU, or from Germany, EU, where there will be no VAT mentioned on the invoice, but where Belgian VAT is due, except if I can argue that there's an exemption that applies on those services. But typically, I have advocacy services from a supplier in the UK. I receive an invoice. Belgian VAT is due because of the local, the B2B place of supply rule. So the VAT is due where the recipient of the service is established. The recipient in this case is the NPO, Belgium established. So Belgian VAT is due, and I should pay that VAT to the Treasury by the reverse charge mechanism. So I have an obligation to register, but there is a special procedure. I can request a special VAT number to the Belgian VAT authorities so that I can submit a special VAT return solely for the payment of that VAT that is due on my intra-community acquisition on those services coming from non-Belgium suppliers. And luckily, in terms of administrative burden, luckily I don't have to file a nil return. So if during a period I didn't receive any incoming invoices from outside Belgium. Typically, I don't have to do anything, but as soon as I do, I should file a special VAT return for the payment of that Belgian VAT that is due. The small...
Yeah, Jean-Baptiste, I see a lot of questions on the application of the reverse charge mechanism. So the special VAT return is indeed the special tax return 629, and it is a typical risk that we see with association. Not only with association, it also happens with banks and insurance companies and so on. Because when you cannot recover input VAT, and when you do not file a standard VAT return, you do not have the reflex to apply VAT when you receive an invoice from abroad. And when I mean abroad, as Jean-Baptiste said, it could be EU or non-EU, it's the same. Just receiving an invoice from abroad, normally you should pay VAT, Belgian VAT on that invoice, because the VAT is due in Belgium for VAT, the country of the recipient of the service. That's the general VAT rule. Then, is there a specific threshold? For instance, I receive an invoice for 200 euro. Well, there is no threshold. The Belgian VAT is due as technically as from the first euro. Of course, the risk with 200 euro is, well, very limited. But it is clearly a risk in a lot of association, because this is not always correctly implemented. And of course, is it visible for the Belgian VAT authorities? If you do not file VAT return and so on, of course, you are unlikely to have a VAT audit. But, well, as advisor, of course, we should play the rules and advise you to look at that and try to correctly apply the rules. If you are working with European suppliers, in most of the case, they will already apply local VAT if you do not provide them with a Belgian VAT number. So if you provide them with a Belgian VAT number, they will not apply their local VAT anymore, but you will have to pay the Belgian VAT, which is the correct way of treating that situation.
Thank you, Leo. Indeed, and the question of the threshold was a good one.
I also see a question and a point from someone saying that when you have a special VAT number, you may have issues because everybody thinks that you have a normal VAT number. And indeed, in the BCE, so the Bank Carrefour, the Kruispunt Bank, it will appear like that, and there is no way to make the difference between a normal and another VAT number, and that will create problem, for instance, with supplier of services related to real estate, that could be cleaning and things like that, because they will apply a reverse charge in Belgium incorrectly. And so it's important to communicate clearly with your suppliers that the VAT number that is mentioned and that you have is only a special VAT number used, and that can only be used to pay VAT on services coming from abroad, also on EU acquisition of goods, but that's less important in the sector of international association.
Yeah.
And I see that, well, when you have already received an invoice with, for example, Dutch VAT, how can you correct the situation? Well, actually, you need to technically to communicate with your supplier and ask him to make a credit note and showing that you paid the VAT in Belgium. It will not always work like that, because some supplier will say, no, at the time we issued the invoice, you did not communicate a Belgian VAT number, so we will not modify our invoice. Then you should keep the situation like this. And because, well, actually, Dutch VAT has been paid, but you still may have a risk in Belgium. So depending on the amounts, it could be something to be discussed with a local VAT inspector. If the amounts are not too important, of course, your risk is low.
Yeah, the question of the threshold was important because, so know if you have services coming from abroad, you should pay Belgian VAT from the first euro. But let's take again that example where you're a mixed VAT taxable person and you get 20,000 euros of revenues that are subject to that. 20,000 euros, that is below a threshold that is applicable locally in Belgium. How is this threshold calculated? Well, you will include turnover of everything that is subject to that. You will also include VAT exempted financial services, VAT exempt rent, but it's less relevant here. You will not include your membership fees and other revenues which benefits from the social VAT exemption. So here, typically in this example, we're below the threshold of 25k. So my non-for-profit organizations, like I said, have two types of revenues, and I do perform services which are subject to VAT for a total amount on a yearly basis of 20,000 euros. I can register for VAT normally, like I explained before, but I can also apply for the small enterprise regime. This regime gives me some advantages. I still have to submit a VAT declaration to the Belgian VAT authorities, but my administrative burden will lower. I do not need to put VAT on my outgoing invoices, although they are subject to VAT, which means I have no VAT deduction right on my cost. So there's a trade-off. It will mainly depend on how much Belgian VAT do you have on your costs, and is it worth it as a mixed VAT taxable person? Is it worth it to have a normal VAT registration where you do issue invoices with VAT on your service fee and can deduct some input VAT on real use or general pro rata, like we've seen before? Is that worth it? Or do you say, actually, I don't have that many costs with Belgian VAT, it's not worth it. My revenues, it's less than 25,000 euros that is subject to VAT. Well, let's not make it complicated. I just file a declaration to the VAT authorities and it ends there. My VAT application ends there. But very important, it's not because I apply this regime that I'm not a VAT taxable person. Here in my example, I am a mixed VAT taxable person. I do perform services that are subject to VAT. I should normally register for VAT and have all these compliance obligations I mentioned before. But in Belgium, we have the small enterprise regime, which enables us to lower the administrative burden. Leo, do you want to go through the summary?
So we've seen the way that typically us as consultants, we would approach the VAT status of an association. First things we do is mapping revenues and then assessing the VAT treatment of those revenue with a special attention to membership fees, because we've seen that this one is more complex, and then looking at all the other revenues of the association. Based on that, we can assess the VAT status of the association and if a first idea of the VAT deduction. Will I be able to recover 100% of the VAT on my cost, 0%, or maybe it will be a percentage because I have activities exempt from VAT and activities subject to VAT. Well, then I need to map and to have a look at my cost in order to determine what will be the best VAT deduction methodology. I could use the general pro rata, so something quite basic, based just on the turnover subject to VAT divided by total turnover, or I can use something a little bit more complex, where I will allocate costs to specific sector in order to maximize my VAT deduction. That is interesting, for instance, if you organize event where you consume a lot of costs subject to VAT, and that you could fully recover input VAT on those costs. And all that will then allow you to determine what are your VAT obligation, compliance, and also, certainly important, to determine the financial impact of the VAT on your budget. A lot of associations have no idea how much VAT they pay, how much VAT is a cost, but this information could be interesting for the board. And if you see that, it could trigger, well, analysis to say, okay, maybe we should do something else in order to minimize the cost and optimize VAT deduction, for instance. Okay, now we are going to look at some specific topic, and I will start with the organization of event, conferences, congress. I will directly start to say this is a very complex matter, and the EU VAT directive has not been written to help the organization of such events. Certainly not. There are a lot of pitfalls, and it's not always easy to find a solution to be 100% compliant. So we should start with that idea. It is something complex, and most of the associations do some mistake. Well, most of the associations also do not have direct audit on that, and so it works. Let's start with the organization of an event in Belgium. Here I am talking about physical event. We will come back afterwards to webinar, online conference, and so on, because since 1 year and a half, this is all what we do, actually. So if I organize a physical event, normally my entrance fee and exhibitor fees will be subject to Belgian VAT, place of the event. So even if I invoice a participant based in Germany, I will apply Belgian VAT, because for VAT, when I organize events, conference, the entrance fee, access fee, is subject to VAT in the country of the event. I should also check if there is a potential VAT exemption that could apply, because we have an exemption for educational services, trainings in Belgium, and that could apply to some conferences sometimes if there is clearly an objective of training. Important point also to mention is that in Belgium there is a specific regime for the organization of events, and that is mostly applied by non-Belgium entities that do organize event or congress or conference in Belgium. And actually it provides with a very simplified VAT registration regime where you only have to file one single Belgian VAT return with all the revenue, all the costs, and the VAT that you need to pay and the VAT that you need to recover. So that is a simplification that exists in Belgium. There are simplifications that exist in other countries, but this is not harmonized at EU level. It depends on each EU country. So when I organize an event in other EU countries, well, typically what are the costs? I have the salaries, I could have a professional congress organizer, I have the rent of the venue, the catering, transportation, new page on my website and things like that. I have in terms of revenue, I have the registration, the sponsor, the exhibitors, publication, and other possible revenue. That is typically the situation. And so we will need to look at the VAT treatment of the revenue, and we will see that we have a problem with the registration, because registration is subject to VAT in the country of organization of the event, meaning that, for example, I organize an event in France. Well, the registration fee is subject to French VAT, meaning that I may have to register for VAT in France. Now, if we look at, and for that we look at different type of participants. We may have B2B participants, so corporate, for instance. Then I clearly may have to register for VAT in France. For instance, if I have to invoice the registration fee for a German company participating to the event in France. There is a change that is coming, that has been implemented as from 1st of July, so that is next week, throughout Europe, and that is an extension of the one-stop shop system that will actually allow to simplify some cases and in some cases to avoid a local VAT registration. But that is technically only working in a B2C situation, meaning that if you have, as in my example, a German company coming in France to an event, technically the one-stop shop system is not applicable, and you still would need to register for VAT in France. So the main issue with the organization of event, conference, congress is that you need to check if there is an obligation to register locally to invoice your registration fee to the participant. You have other type of revenue like sponsor, but sponsoring will be in most cases regarded as advertising services with application of the standard business-to-business rules, meaning that a Belgian association can issue an invoice without VAT to a German corporate for an event in France, where the German entity will have its logo and things like that. So there is no specific VAT issue. For the exhibitors, meaning that you have a company that wants to have a stand during a congress, technically it is normally also regarded as a B2B service. And then if you have to invoice other things like catering, transportation of people on site and things like that, you will have the same problem that for the registration, because local VAT will be due. So problem is mostly coming from the registration. Is there a solution to solve that? Not directly. We see that with the one-stop shop, there is a solution for the B2C registration, but it will not help for all the registration. So the problem remains. So that is slide where I will repeat a little bit what I said. It's important to check the rules locally. In a lot of countries, you have a threshold for registration, for VAT registration, meaning that if you are below that threshold, you will not have to register for VAT. You could also have specific VAT exemption that could apply to your event. It could be regarded as vocational training, so exempted. There are also exemptions for some conferences with specific conditions depending on the countries. So that could apply, but to be checked locally, because there is no harmonization through the European Union on that. When you organize big events and that you have people staying there a few days and so on, it's important to also check if you could create a VAT or a corporate tax establishment. That I've seen that in some countries, and it could be painful because then the tax authorities ask to tax part of the revenue of the event locally. It's not happening in all cases, but certainly if you have really big events, that's a point to be checked. So all those VAT aspects are quite tricky and quite annoying when organizing an event. There are so many things to be checked, but then you have this additional layer coming from the tax and VAT. It is important because it has an impact on the budget of the event. And when you start the registration page on your website, I would say it's quite important to know if VAT is included or not in the registration fee, because otherwise you will have budget problem at the end if that situation has not been cleared. That's typical issue that we see. Then if I look at the cost that you will support when organizing an event, you may work with a professional congress organizer that will help to organize everything. That kind of services is subject to the general B2B rules, meaning that, well, for VAT, no big issue. Then you have different services where local VAT will be charged. It could be for the utilization of the venue, exhibition hall, things like that. Could be for the catering, could be for local transport of people. And so you have different costs where the VAT of the country where the event is organized will be charged. And the question is, of course, how can I recover that VAT, that local VAT? And that will depend if you have a local VAT registration for the organization of the event, normally the VAT deduction will be quite easy. If you do not have any registration, well, you may try to use the EU VAT refund procedure. However, that will depend if there was no obligation to register locally to invoice the registration fee, of course. We will also see that there are ways to work with a professional congress organizer to mitigate that issue of input VAT recovery. And for all the costs where the Belgian VAT is due, for example, consultants adapting the website, the invoice from the PCO, then you should check, according to the Belgian VAT rules, if that VAT is fully recoverable or not. And that will mostly depend on the VAT treatment of the revenue linked to the event. So if the event is subject to VAT, you should normally be able to recover the VAT. And then I come back to what Jean-Baptiste explained. Depending on the VAT deduction methodology that you used, if you use a general pro rata, of course, you will only be able to recover a percentage. If you use the real use methodology, then you may be able to recover 100% in some cases. So that's why it is also important to look at that. Well, what we often see is that actually events, not very big one, but event conferences are organized without looking at the tax aspect. So technically, there is a risk. It might not be correct, but it is what's happened in practice. Of course, if you do that and you support local VAT on some costs, you should not try to recover input VAT, because it's likely that the registration fee that you invoiced was not correct from a VAT point of view, as you did not charge any local VAT. So, of course, we cannot advise that, but it happens. So, of course, if you organize a small event in an EU country, very occasionally, well, the risks are limited, of course. Then, when you work with a professional congress organizer, the situation can be simplified in a certain way, but the agreement with professional congress organizers are sometimes quite complex. And what I've seen sometimes is that they clearly mention that they will solve all the VAT issues because they have a local VAT number in the country where the event is organized. And this is true, but not totally true, because what they can indeed do is receive invoices directly from the supplier, for example, for the utilization of the venue, for local catering and things like that. And they will be able to recover input VAT on that. And then we have the problem of the registration fee, because the PCO will sometimes invoice the registration fee with his own local VAT number, meaning that from an accounting and legal point of view, the revenue is not coming to you, but on its account. And then we see that we have mismatch, we have balancing accounts and things like that, which are not always correctly implemented. In practice, it can work, but my message here is pay attention with this kind of agreement with the PCO to really look at the legal flow of invoices, the flow of cash, and the compensation that are made by the PCO for the organization of the event. Because from a legal point of view, if you organize the event, you should issue the invoice for the registration, unless you give a specific right to the PCO to do that, but then it's another kind of contract. So working with a PCO could certainly help, but be careful with some contract and be aware that sometimes there might be some risk. So that was a short word on the Congress. In practice, what we do when we when an association is organizing a congress in another country, well, we check locally with a kind of questionnaire the rules that are applying in order to define the best approach. That's the standard way of working, of course.
So now we've seen the VAT treatment, and all the VAT aspects and how complex it can be when we organize events outside of Belgium. Now, what we've been doing quite a lot since the COVID pandemic is webinars and virtual seminars. And there, the first question one should raise is it subject to VAT, or can I benefit from a VAT exemption? Can I benefit from a VAT exemption? Because we've mentioned it before in the Belgian VAT legislation, there are some exemptions that could apply, because one can argue that it's for a training, there's an educational purpose, or there are some exemptions for the organization of conferences if very specific conditions are met. So is the webinar that Belgium established non-for-profit organization organize, is that webinar exempt of VAT? Maybe that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis, but let's assume it's not, and it can very well be subject to VAT. And in that case, well, we will easily fall under the definition of an electronically supplied service. Because there is limited interaction often limited interaction between the speaker and the attendees. So what is then the question is then, what is the VAT treatment of an electronically supplied service that is subject to VAT? Where is the VAT due? Well, typically if we saw before on the physical conferences that one had to look at where the conferences took place. So the VAT was due where the conference took actually place. With a webinar, I'm organizing a webinar as from Belgium, but actually what I need to look at is where are my attendees located? Because my VAT is due where they are established. So here are 3 types of scenarios. I can have Belgium attendees, corporate or individuals. I will issue an invoice with the standard VAT rate of Belgian VAT. Again, my assumption is my webinar is not exempt of VAT, it is subject to VAT. There's limited interaction, so it's an electronically supplied service. So it's located where the attendee is established. So here, Belgium established attendees, I will issue invoices with Belgium VAT. If I have attendees that are established outside Belgium in another EU member state and they have valid VAT number, corporate, local associations, and again, we'll send the link from the website of the European Commission where you can check the validity of the VAT number of your attendees. Well, there, again, no Belgian VAT will be on your invoice, but VAT is due where the attendee is established. And so it's the attendee who needs to pay local VAT via the reverse charge mechanism, and you, as a non-for-profit organization which is registered to VAT and which performs a service here, an electronic service which is subject to VAT, well, you should report it in your Belgian VAT return, and you should also report it in your EC sales listing. And quite easy, if your attendees are outside the EU, well, then typically you will not put any VAT on your invoice. So same remark as before, it's very important to look at the VAT status of your attendees, and that's definitely facilitate your analysis of the VAT treatment, invoicing requirements, and VAT reporting obligations. So here we saw 3 types of scenarios, and you may say, well, there's one missing. What if I am organizing a webinar, it is subject to VAT, it is an electronic service, and my attendee is a private individual, B2C. Well, there, Lionel already mentioned it before. We may have a simplification. As we mentioned, the VAT is due where the attendee is located. So if I have, I'm a Belgium established NPO, organizing a webinar, limited interaction, subject to VAT, and I have among my attendees a German private individual, normally German VAT is due. And as from the 1st of July this year, we have some new rules coming into effect. You may have heard of them, related, among others, to the distance sales of goods, but which can also include services in B2C. So it will replace what has existed till now. The MOS will be replaced by the OS, the one-stop shop. And this will enable you to avoid a local VAT registration, because I mentioned my German attendee, private individual, German VAT is due. So in principle, I should register for VAT in Germany so that I can issue an invoice with German VAT. That's quite an administrative burden. So with the OS, I have a simplification. I register for the OS here in Belgium, where I am established. I register for the OS in Belgium, and I can then submit a return on a quarterly basis, where I then pay to the treasury that German VAT. So I pay it to the Belgian VAT authorities, and they then get it sorted out and redistribute it to Germany. And this is definitely a simplification which is worth considering, because the alternative is a local VAT registration. And here I took the assumption that my webinar qualified as an electronic service, because I said that there was interaction, participation between the organizer and the participants, a limited interaction. But should I have active participation, then actually Belgian VAT is due, because if I have active participation, then I don't fall under the definition of an electronic service, and Belgian VAT will be due. Lena, do you want to add one thing on the OS before going to the next slide?
I see a few questions. I see someone saying, well, that they organized an event online charging 21% Belgian VAT to everybody. I think that is not correct, because indeed, for example, if you're a B2B participant, the VAT would be due in their country. Is there a risk? Well, to the extent, if you charge Belgian VAT on an invoice and you pay that VAT through your VAT return, well, the Belgian VAT authorities cannot say anything. It's well, it's maybe not correct, but it's like that. But of course, the situation is difficult, because it's new for everybody to organize events, online events, online conference, and things like that. I think that as from now, we should clearly pay more attention to that, and how to issue correctly the invoices. Certainly, if you do that very regularly, and that the revenue are important. So in that case, it is important, certainly quite important, to apply correct VAT treatment.
Is there another question that you want to raise before going to the grants?
I see. Well, the question about B2B, B2C client, it is indeed not always an easy question. Certainly, if you work with local association, with universities, with other not-for-profit association, it's easy with private individual, that is B2C, with other entities, more complex. And so it is important in the registration process to clearly ask what is their VAT status. Because, for example, working with university in Belgium, most of the university, for example, have a Belgian VAT number, but sometimes it is only the accounting department that is aware of that. So it is so in the registration process, asking the VAT status is important in order to help you to have a good VAT treatment, and it's also so show the diligence that you have in organizing the event and the VAT treatment. So in case of a discussion of the VAT authorities, that will also help you. I see a question on webinar and exemption. Yes, indeed, webinar could be exempt from VAT. Mostly because they could be related to training. For example, the webinar that we are giving this morning is, well, if a fee was requested, it would be subject to VAT because PwC is not a not-for-profit association. But if PwC was a not-for-profit association, then the registration fee would be VAT exempt because this is clearly considered as educational training, professional training, I would say. We can go to the, well, a few words on grant agreement, because a lot of associations based in Brussels receive grant from the EU Commission or an agency of the EU Commission. And from a VAT point of view, it could also be a little bit tricky. Certainly also because the amount at stake could be significant. And so it's important to be sure that what we do is correctly implemented also from a VAT point of view. First thing I would say is we need to make a difference between a grant and a tender. So when the EU Commission issue a tender, several companies or associations will reply to that. One will be chosen, and a services agreement will be signed with the EU Commission. For example, as PwC, we have several contracts with the EU Commission. We issue invoices to the EU Commission. There is no VAT on those invoices because the EU Commission benefits from a specific VAT exemption. But we can fully recover input VAT linked to those services because the exemption is what we call an exemption with input VAT recovery. So a tender, that's quite easy from a VAT point of view and quite advantageous also because you can issue an invoice with an exemption and you have no problem on the VAT deduction. A grant, something different. Grant in Belgium is generally considered as a kind of subvention. So not the remuneration of a service, and so it falls outside the scope of the VAT. So you do not issue an invoice to the EU Commission for your grant. You receive the money without issuing invoices. From a technical point of view, it can sometimes be discussed because if we look at a grant agreement where you have different milestones, tasks to be completed and things like that, for me, it really looks like a services agreement. And we had cases in the past where we had agreement from the Belgian VAT authorities to say, okay, this agreement is actually named a grant agreement. It is a services agreement subject to VAT from a VAT point of view. But that is not the common practice. In most of the case, it will be regarded as a subvention and not as the price for a service. Then several questions arise, and because what we often see is that the association receiving a grant is not working alone. It is working with other associations or other companies that will share actually the money received from the EU Commission to perform certain tasks. Common approach on that is to say that all the entities being part of the consortium can exchange the money without applying VAT, because we have one main association, so the representative of the consortium receiving the grant and then distributing the grant to other members of the consortium, depending on their costs and activities to perform the activities for which the grant has been allowed. And so the flow of money there is normally not subject to VAT. What would be subject to VAT is, for instance, if one association, the representative, is invoicing the other member of the consortium in order to perform the administration of the consortium. So in that case, and it does not happen in all situations, but in that case, this will be regarded as a VAT taxable service. I see different questions on grant. And of course, this is a sensitive topic because, as I said, the amount we are playing with can be quite significant. And the VAT treatment will depend on also the organization of the consortium, where are the members of the consortium based, and so on. So several questions may arise, not only in Belgium, but also in other countries, where the approach could sometimes be a little bit different. One of the questions was, if I pay a services provider with the money that I received from the EU Commission. Well, actually, there will be no VAT exemption in the relationship between the Belgian association and the services provider, because those are two independent parties. The services provider is not a member of the consortium, and so he will need to normally to apply VAT. And we cannot directly apply the exemption for that is applicable to the EU Commission, because the services is provided to the association and not to the EU Commission that received the grant. So we should be careful with that. But then the question arises, well, can I recover the VAT on the services provided by this external supplier? That will depend on the situation. Maybe we can go to the next slide. And I would say that will depend on the VAT status of the association. If there is an association with full VAT deduction, in some cases you will be able to recover all VAT on the cost related to the project. We should also look at if there are revenues generated from the activities related to the grant. For example, if you organize paying conferences, then, well, you have a VAT taxable revenue that will generate input VAT deduction. If you organize free conferences, there is no VATable revenue, and technically your VAT deduction will be limited. You need to also to look at the different costs related to this grant. Are they subject to VAT or are they VAT exemption? And one point that is of course very important is, can we include the non-deductible VAT in the eligible expenses so that the grant will cover the VAT cost? That is quite important to assess at the beginning of the project in order to define, well, will VAT be a cost or not? In most of the grant agreement, the VAT could be, the non-deductible VAT could be considered as eligible expenses, so that could be refunded. But we often see a problem to prove that the VAT is not deductible, and so on. Also, in terms of post-audit expense organized by the EU Commission. So that's certainly a point to define at the beginning of the project between the member of the consortium. We'll look at a different question here. Okay, I see different question, but we will try to reply to that individually. So for me, grant agreement is a very special object from a VAT point of view. And planning and organizing the VAT process at the beginning of the project is really key to avoid surprises. Because and that should be organized between all the members of the consortium, of course.
Yeah.
Go.
Yeah, I'm mindful of the time, and there are some slides where we actually have already seen most of this. So short recap, if I'm in Belgium non-for-profit organization and I have services from Belgium suppliers, EU suppliers, non-EU suppliers, foreign suppliers, for the supply of services, and they issue invoices to me. Well, the Belgium supplier, it's not so much of an issue. If I'm fully VAT exempt NPO, well, that Belgian VAT will be a cost for me. But if those suppliers are foreign, Belgian VAT may be due, and I will have to pay it through via the reverse charge mechanism, request a special VAT number, submit a special VAT return, as explained earlier. And the director fees, I said I would go quickly into it. If I have a director which is actually on the payroll of the NPO, then what he gets as remuneration is a salary. There's no VAT due. If I have a director which sends supply services and issues invoices from his management company, their VAT is due, be it if he's Belgium established and he will issue an invoice with Belgium VAT, or if he is foreign established, well, again, I receive an invoice without VAT, but I need to reverse charge that VAT. I need to have that special VAT number so that I can pay that Belgian VAT that is due. And I mentioned early on a tolerance in Belgium for if I have now a director that is acting as a private individual, sending his invoice for the services he has rendered. No VAT will be due in Belgium. That is a local tolerance. Careful, that may not be the case. Other EU member states may not have the same tolerance. and it should be looked at what the services actually contains, what is actually the nature of that service. So that is something to bear in mind and to watch out for. The recharge of cost, Leo?
Yeah. So, well, the point, the previous slides is important for some association where there are some people working with management companies. So the director of the association actually, and that could be a significant cost. And if we have to add Belgian VAT on that, and if the Belgian VAT is not recoverable, then it could become an issue. So it's important to look at the different way to mitigate that. No easy way, of course, to mitigate that. And then another point that is relating to something that we often see is recharge of cost between different associations that could be sister association, things like that. Well, the general rule is as soon as you charge something between different legal entities, VAT is due. Example, one association is doing a little bit of administration for another association and recharge part of the salary of some administrative staff. VAT will be due on that. The fact that you do not apply a markup so that you work at cost will not change the situation. VAT will be due. And so recharging of cost between associations is an issue when those associations cannot fully recover input VAT because you create an additional cost of non-deductible VAT. Of course, and that is only true if we work with recharge of cost between different legal entities, because sometimes we see that we have sub-association and things like that that are created just to, I don't know, to have specific projects, technical committees and things like that. If those have no legal personality, actually they are part of the same association, and it is just for the analytic accounting that there is a difference and a recharge of cost between those sub-association entities, I would say. So is there a solution to mitigate those this VAT leakage? It could be. So it's possible to implement VAT cost sharing structure, which is a specific VAT exemption that could apply under specific conditions that I will not detail today, but this could certainly be applied between different not-for-profit associations. It is very often applied in the social sector in Belgium between not-for-profit association. I have not seen it a lot between not-for-profit sector association based in Brussels. But if you have a real problem with recharging of cost between associations, it is a solution. Another one could be VAT grouping, also with very specific conditions, but in some cases that could be implemented. So be careful with those recharge of cost, because that is often something that is below the radar, I would say, and that could create a risk that will be very easily spotted in case of VAT audit. Okay, very quickly, some real estate points. Most of the associations based in Brussels are renting their offices. So, and this rent is exempt from VAT. You only pay VAT on some charges like electricity and things like that. So technically, VAT is not really a special topic for not-for-profit association. However, since 2018, it is possible to apply VAT on rent when the building has been constructed after September 2018. Well, there are not that much new building in the Schumann quarter, but there's a lot of new development projects, and so I anticipate, and I've already seen that with real estate developer, that they start discussing with tenants that could be NPOs to apply VAT on the rent. And so, of course, if your association cannot recover input VAT, that will create an additional cost. So clearly negotiate then with the owner of the building, because for him, he may want to apply VAT in all cases to secure its VAT deduction. For you, it will be a cost, so it's a point of negotiation. But this is something that we will see in the future with new building being constructed in the center of Brussels. Another small item is the short-term rental. Short-term rental of room spaces is always subject to VAT, with the exception of rental to NPOs, private individual or entity benefiting of a social VAT exemption. So in my example below, if your association is renting a room for a day, normally it will not be subject to VAT. Having said that, I would say that if you rent a room with services, like it happened in some hotels and things like that, because they provide a little bit of catering, then it will be subject to VAT. But if there is no services, no VAT will apply. If on your side you subrent a room to another association, it will also not be subject to VAT. If you subrent a room to a corporate for a period of less than 6 months, it will be subject to VAT. So be sometimes careful with that, because I see that association sometimes subrent part of their offices and things like that. So VAT could also apply there. Well, I see a lot of questions. We will not be able to answer all the questions, certainly. I see one interesting here. If the director of the association or any person is working outside Belgium, how would that work? Well, if you have an employee working outside Belgium, so you could have an employee on the payroll working outside Belgium. From a VAT point of view, nothing will happen because it's an employee. However, you will have to pay and to do all the compliance for the social charges and things like that locally, so in the country where he is working. If it is a director working as not as an employee, then the same rule will apply as explained by Jean-Baptiste. So if he is working as a private individual, no VAT will apply on its director fees. Belgian VAT will apply on service fees. And if he's working through a company, management company, for instance, then VAT will always apply. I see a question here. Do we charge Belgian VAT on salary costs we charge our Japanese member for? Well, that's an interesting question. If you charge salary cost, it is likely that you provide some kind of services. And so actually, in most of the cases, you are not recharging salary costs, but some kind of services, research, for instance, or anything else. And this will be in the scope of VAT. In the example here, it is a Japanese member, so outside the EU. And so you will provide a service to someone that is established outside the EU, and normally no VAT will apply on that, unless the services are, I don't know, connected to real estate in Belgium and things like that. But most of the cases, no Belgian VAT will apply. But be really careful when we talk about recharging salary costs, because for me, in my practice, in most cases, recharging salary costs is something subject to VAT because it is the consideration for the services. I see another one, exchange of cost between a US entity, a US association and a Belgian association. Well, if you pay something on the services provided on the costs recharged by the US association, technically you should apply the reverse charge in Belgium. And so Belgian VAT would be due. And it could be a problem if you have a limited right to input VAT deduction. I've seen that in several cases between Belgian association and Swiss association. There are ways to mitigate that, but it should be looked at because it is clearly a risk from a VAT point of view. I see that we exceeded the time that we proposed, so I would propose to close the webinar. Thanks a lot for all the questions raised. I hope that that was helpful for you. We could not cover everything in detail, also because I think that every case is a little bit different. Certainly, for example, for the grant agreement and things like that. We are, of course, happy to help you for your question. We will come back to some of you that raised question, just to have an informal discussion and to see what we think clearly on the question raised. And I would say, well, thanks a lot again for the participation. There was a lot of people participating today and a lot of registration of people just asking for the recording and the slides. We will, of course, provide the recording and the slides to everybody. And do not hesitate to come back to us if you have a question, doubts about VAT and your association. Thank you very much.
Thank you.